The New York Yankees. How they got so rich. Illegally. To a casual observer, the New York Yankees are an organization with a reputation for paying big money for so-called top players for their team and using the mainstream media to encourage hordes of fans to buy overpriced game tickets, merchandise, and stadium food. George Steinbrenner is accredited and applauded by those media for turning an investment of around $10 million into a company worth around $3 billion today. On the surface, it seems quite an accomplishment, until we dig deeper and see that Steinbrenner used illegal and immoral means to achieve a lot of that. Yeah, he was more than just a mean boss. He cheated big time. While his team was playing games on the baseball field, Steinbrenner was playing games using shady business deals and methods, while convincing his people that they were working with champions. Steinbrenner kept 2 sets of books, which is illegal for a private company like the Yankees. A typical business operates by spending some money to make more money. Supplies are purchased, operating costs are paid, the product or service is produced, and revenue is collected from customers. Keeping 2 sets of books is the practice of attempting to hide or disguise certain financial transactions, spending money, making money, by having 1 set of fraudulent accounting books or records for official use to show the Internal Revenue Service at tax time, and a second set listing the transactions actually taking place for private records. In other words, deliberately changing parts of transactions by entering false information to conceal revenue and avoid taxes. Bribes, kickbacks, and other off-the-record payoffs by the participation and silence of individuals involved. Keeping 2 sets of books is also known as cooking the books, juggling the accounts, or creative accounting. Here's another way of looking at it. When business crooks commit accounting fraud, they also want to keep track of the real story, so they keep 2 sets of books. One with the false numbers reported to the IRS as the official record, and one with the real numbers for themselves, so they know how the business is really doing. After the real, actual numbers are noted, they destroy the disposable set of books. Steinbrenner told his office staff keeping financial records what to keep and what to destroy, and they obediently did what they were told, if they wanted to keep their jobs. At least once a week, an office worker loaded a cart with boxes of papers, took them down the elevator to the basement of the old stadium, and wheeled them to the end of the corridor, past the umpire's room, past the player's fitness room, past the batting cage room, to the old metal container, where they threw the papers in, squirted some flammable liquid, and tossed in a lit match. The papers burned, and the person wheeled the cart and empty boxes back up to the offices. And when paper shredders became popular, for several weeks, shredded paper was brought down in big plastic bags and burned. That's paranoia about destroying evidence. After he bought the Yankees, Steinbrenner still had a hand in running his other company, American Shipbuilding, but gradually its problems got worse until he drove it into bankruptcy. However, he did learn how to use dummy corporations, and was determined to do whatever it took to make the Yankees organization a financial success. For the Yankees, Steinbrenner used an entity named River Operating, Inc. as a dummy corporation for several purposes. For example, to avoid paying taxes, and to protect him and the Yankees organization from liability if they lost a damaging court case. River Operating is only a name, not an actual company, even though it's listed as active in a file at the New York Department of State. It has the appearance of being a company, even with a CEO. Today that's Marty Greenspun, formerly CFO of the Yankees organization, but he suddenly quit the organization, wonder why, and suddenly returned, wonder why, with other sudden goings and comings from the West Coast in between, and is now only in charge of one of the stadium's restaurants, and is also VP of Strategic Ventures, which sounds ominous. But as we know, appearances can be deceiving. The other name attached to River Operating is lawyer Lon Trost. No surprise there. He did everything Steinbrenner ordered him to. The willing lawyer and the wonder-why financial guy. It's the Steinbrenner way. River Operating has no assets and is therefore misleading and concealing truth about the actual finances of the Yankees organization. Very devious, George. But Steinbrenner didn't make any effort to hide river operating from his people. His executives, managers, office staff, and several other employees were aware that river operating was a dummy company and that it was used to pay part-time employees less than minimum wage with no benefits, and it deducted taxes from their pay, but didn't forward those taxes to the IRS as Steinbrenner should have. Those paychecks listed River Operating, Inc. as the payer, and there was a bank account with the name of River Operating, but only enough money was deposited to cover the dollar amount of those paychecks. Here's some of Steinbrenner's other despicable and immoral business practices. He delayed payments to employees. Sometimes certain departments of employees would have to wait for their pay, sometimes a few weeks or longer, just because Steinbrenner felt like it. He tested them to see how long they could go without being paid, to see how loudly they complained. They complained to each other, but never to Steinbrenner, since, well, they wanted to keep their jobs. He delayed payments to most suppliers as long as possible, until they threatened to sue. Then he'd send someone to settle with the supplier outside the courtroom for less than he owed them. He got rid of elderly employees just before their retirement age. They had worked for the Yankees for several years, but Steinbrenner didn't want to have to pay them an old age pension, since that cost him money. Usually the employee protested, but it didn't matter. Steinbrenner would just have a manager stand up and say that the employee had stolen something from the company. And even though everyone knew that the employee was innocent, if the accusation was made loud enough and long enough, the poor old employee gave up and left without a company pension. Sometimes he asked employees to take a pay cut. Some refused, others took the cut because, well, they were afraid of losing their jobs. Steinbrenner used shell companies, too. We know that Steinbrenner used shell companies to move money so that it couldn't be traced back to him. For example, in his conversations with his buddy, President Ronald Reagan, regarding the Iran-contra weapons scandal, Steinbrenner talked about profiting from secretly selling weapons to somebody in Iran. We're not making this stuff up. It really happened. Keep in mind that George Steinbrenner was fully entrenched as a crook, a criminal. He had a record as a twice convicted felon, and that was at the start of his ownership of the Yankees. He was convicted once for pleading guilty to conspiracy and being indicted on 14 counts of making illegal contributions to Richard "I'm not a crook" Nixon's re-election campaign. Steinbrenner had forced 6 employees at a shipbuilding company to commit a deception. Using a dummy corporation, he'd written them bonus checks, which they deposited into their own bank accounts. Then he'd ordered them to write checks in their own names to Nixon's re-election campaign committee. Then he'd ordered them to deny that he'd ordered them to do it, if the matter ever got to court. Fortunately it did, and Steinbrenner was burnt toast. He was convicted a second time for a felony charge of obstruction of justice related to the above. Since he owned the Yankees while those convictions took place, he was banned from baseball for 2 years by MLB Commissioner Bowie Kuhn. And years later, when he wrote a $40,000 check to Howard Spira to dig up dirt on player Dave Winfield so Steinbrenner wouldn't have to honor Winfield's contract, the old goat was permanently banned from day-to-day management of his team by MLB Commissioner Fay Vincent. However, in both cases of banishment from Major League Baseball, the governing body of the sport, Steinbrenner defied the orders and continued to keep in touch with his organization daily by phone. It's obvious that Steinbrenner never felt threatened by any authority, and he continued his illegal ways throughout his years of ownership of the Yankees. His pattern of illicit behavior is well established. He also knew about his players' steroid use, their daily clubhouse gambling, and their other nefarious activities, but he did nothing about it. He did whatever it took to win, whether it was legal or not, and psychologically, maybe even psychotically, he needed to win to please his father Henry, who he could never satisfy. Now, you have to ask yourself, why would we go through all this stuff in the past about George Steinbrenner, who the media considered a saint, because the odd time he donated a written-off trinket to some charity at an event well covered by the media, while he treated most of his own people like human excrement. Here's an excerpt from the book Abused by the New York Yankees. You had to work for the organization to see what Steinbrenner was getting away with, to understand the extent of the old man's enormous greed. He wanted to squeeze as much profit as he could for the top echelon of the organization, himself, his family, the partners, and the senior execs. And he made his execs cut whatever corners and delay whatever payments to squeeze people and suppliers as hard as they could, so he could achieve his profit goals. That made him proud. And when he stripped his part-time and low-level employees of their dignity by paying them less than minimum wage and often late, plus denigrating them out loud and embarrassing them, usually in front of their peers, he was essentially telling them that he owned them. What a pompous ass. Yeah, there was always someone eager to work for the world-famous Yankees, and Steinbrenner exploited that to the hilt. Always reminded his workers that if they didn't like it, they could leave any time. There was always someone waiting to take their place. We wonder if it's possible that some of the nefarious business practices and activities that George cultivated and nurtured are continuing today. The short answer? Maybe. After all, he left obedient but reluctant son Hal officially in charge, supposedly calling the shots, flanked by two faithful George-obedient lawyers, Lon Trost and Randy Levine. Remember the day a few years ago when a rumor appeared in a trashy gossip rag, the New York Daily News, about the Yankees supposedly willing to sell the team, the franchise, the Golden Goose? At the risk of having a heart attack, Trost suddenly appeared in front of a quickly assembled throng of loyal media to emphatically scream that the Steinbrenner family had no intention whatsoever, now or ever, to sell the team. Is Trost afraid of losing his precious job? Come on, Lonnie, you're an old guy now. It's time for pasture. As for Hal being accused by some cagey reporters of not caring enough about running the team, the organization, the media interviews, the headaches, Hal did always prefer the quiet life in Tampa and flying his planes. Can't blame him. And just think, if the Yankees are officially reporting they're worth around $3 billion, can you imagine how much more they're really worth? By the way, we have proof, evidence, that the Yankees committed crimes for which they've never been charged or punished. They're guilty, and they're not talking because they're afraid to incriminate themselves. It's all in our book. They haven't sued us because of it, and it's officially too late to sue us. So we have them by the balls. Go ahead, ask them. They won't talk. By the way, do the 17 limited partners know about this stuff? We heard a rumor that one of them is selling his stake. By the way, we've notified the U.S. Attorney's Office in New York City in case they want to investigate. By the way, if any former or current employees want to contact us, they can reach us through our website, abusedbytheyankees.com.